Hello and welcome to episode 2 of What's Tom Reading? I'm Tom, and this week I'm talking about the nonfiction book Antifragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the show. All right, so as I said, this week I read Antifragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. The book is a nonfiction compilation of many of Taleb's best essays on it. Best way I've come up to describe them is, and kind of the way that he describes them, is extremely low probability phenomena and their impact on the systems that encounter them. And if that doesn't have you jumping out of your seat with excitement at the prospect of learning about that, I can't say that I blame you. Full disclosure, this book was recommended to me by a friend during a conversation we were having that was, I think, a little bit above our pay grade, but you know the kind. You've definitely participated in those. And it just so happens that I had previously read some of Taleb's other work called The Black Swan, which also deals with small probability events. So I knew a little bit about what I was getting into. And quick shout out, Spencer, if you're out there and you ever hear this, thank you very much for the excellent recommendation. This was a fantastic read, and I was interested in this book from start to finish. And any of you out there in real space who know me IRL, I love getting book recommendations. And if you recommend a good one, I will read it, and then I will probably do this podcast on it. So anyways, I will be the first person to say that this book might not be everyone's cup of tea. But that's the utility that I'm hopefully bringing to you with this podcast. I have distilled a handful of my favorite takeaways from this kind of highfalutin tome of what is honestly often pretentious academic jargon into what I hope will be an entertaining little snippet for you. Now, if this does sound like something that might ring your bell, then as always, I encourage you to go out and get the book. I certainly found it to be a page turner, and I don't have that high of a tolerance for academic schmoozy woozy crap. So, and there is some of that in this book for sure. But Taleb he's almost like a punk rock academic in a lot of ways. In fact, I'll give you a little background on the author. So Taleb is a Lebanese American economist. He's an essayist and an agitant, in that he agitates people in the field of decision theory, probability, and statistics. He earned his PhD in Paris with his thesis on the microstructure of dynamic hedging, which I'll admit isn't exactly high up on my reading list at the moment, but it's obviously something that was interesting enough for him to want to sink a chunk of his life into. So, I mean, maybe I will read it someday. But one thing that readers of Taleb's books and essays get right away is that the man has a lot of attitude. He's like all about getting right into people's faces and telling them exactly what he thinks. And because of this, he has made himself a lot of enemies in the high octane drugs, sex, and rock and roll fueled field of economics. He mentions multiple times throughout the book all the death threats and people coming after him that he gets. So he's obviously doing something to rattle a lot of people's cages. He also talks about how shredded he is from all of his working out so that he can look like a bodyguard rather than having to hire a bodyguard. So, you get the sense as you read that he's both a very, very intelligent man, but also kind of an arrogant man as well. And as you read the book, you can see why he might not have that many friends. I hate to speak ill of the man because I really liked his book, but he's the kind of person who I think would probably rub most of us the wrong way. So, and yeah, like basically as you read, you get the sense that you wouldn't like him very much and that he would like you even less. So, kind of that sort of vibe. But that said, it is very entertaining to me to listen to a man who he's just hell bent on ripping up every presumption of every one of his peers and subjecting their work to like the most blazing criticism. And as someone who has been in school for a lot of years now, I have had my personal fill of academic types who speak often, learn little, and rest easy on laurels they earned in their youth. I've had, I want to say, I've had many wonderful mentors and professors throughout my academic career, throughout my life. And I don't want any of them who might be listening to this to feel bad. I promise. If I did not directly butt heads with you in real life, then you aren't the person that I'm talking about here. Because you see, although Taleb is obviously a scary genius and I am far, far, far from it, at least the genius part, I too have had my share of run-ins with authority over the years. I've had sour dealings with a few professors and teachers who thought that attending an Ivy League university and then fetching coffee at some enormous law firm for 3 years before going into academia earned absolute deference and respect from me, and it does not, I regret to say. I tend to respect people who have been there and done something with their lives. I tend to respect people who have worked with their hands before. I tend not to have as much respect for people who have had kind of things handed to them and then taken like the really traditional route to academic power. That just doesn't really sit right with me. And so I usually take what they say with a decent sized grain of salt. If, on the other hand, you are more, I guess, orthodox in your approach to professors, where you just respect them, and you should, right? Like I think I'm the person who's wrong here. I don't know. I was born with something inside me that makes me chafe under the smallest amount of arbitrary power. But most people, I think, like their professors and respect them, and you should. I am the person who is wrong here for sure. But one thing I will say, one thing that has become just abundantly clear to me over the years of attending university and law school and business school and all this stuff, is that all the people who are running the world they're just as ordinary as any of the rest of us. Like, they're smart and they work hard, and a lot of them have been very lucky. But most of them, if they're honest with themselves and if you really, really evaluate them, they don't know that much about what they're doing. Like, they've just lived a life and tried to do the best they can, and they are where they are. And so they want to kind of turn around and teach other people, but they don't necessarily, have it all figured out. And I don't have to tell you that. A cursory look around the wider world will show you just how average and often below average the people who are running this place tend to be. So yeah, I guess if you're disposed with a compulsion, long story short, to question authority the way I am, then I have a feeling that you would get the same kick out of Taleb's writing style as I do. It's so refreshing to hear like this smug, self-righteous, uber-thinking guy turn his big guns on his own kind. I got a huge kick out of it. And yeah. I need to like backtrack here a little bit because I'm starting to feel a little guilty. I don't mean to imply that I don't have any respect for any authority on any subject. On the contrary, I have tremendous respect for people who are dedicated to their craft, eager to learn, and like actively trying to better themselves all the time. Those are the professors and people in my life who I've loved best. And I'm happy to report that they are the majority in my experience. Your mileage may vary on that one, I guess, but my experience has been mostly with very good, hardworking people. And that respect for hardworking authorities on a subject led me to some interesting places while I was reading this book, because Taleb just absolutely tears into a couple of other authors whose books I have read and enjoyed. In fact, a couple of them are very prominent in their field and wrote books that I actually really got a lot out of. It's like almost outrageous to hear Taleb just like shred into prominent thinkers like Thomas Friedman and Adam Grant and call them incompetent quacks. You really, really get the sense that Taleb doesn't have very many friends, unfortunately. So let me get back to the book. Here now. I've told you about the author, and probably too much about myself. But we're early stages here, so we're getting to know each other. You're still testing the waters on this podcast. Hopefully I haven't turned you all off. But so the argument of this book, Antifragile, is fairly straightforward. If you distill it down, basically the author asks you, what is the opposite of fragile? Normal people like you and I would probably say something like strong, robust, sturdy, unbreakable, or something to that effect. Taleb would then probably slap you in the face and say, wrong, idiot. The opposite of fragile is anti-fragile. If something fragile is harmed by sudden changes, then it isn't simply enough for the opposite of something fragile to be unharmed by sudden changes, but to be actively helped by sudden changes to the equilibrium. It's a dumb definition. I'll be the first to say it. It's counterintuitive to most people, myself included. And that's because the author explains that we don't have much experience with real world objects that are anti-fragile, right? Like you often see packages marked fragile, handle with care, or packages that aren't marked at all, but you almost certainly have never seen a package marked with anti-fragile. Please kick, drop, and smash this package so that we can improve its contents. That's not usually a normal thing. But that said, the premise of the book is that there are far larger systems in the world that they are actually anti-fragile. That is, they benefit from extreme and unlikely events. I think we can like rule out basically every invention of man as being somewhere on the spectrum between like somewhat fragile and extremely fragile. But larger systems that exist in nature and outside of man's control seem to sometimes genuinely benefit from these outlier black swan events. And a good example of this might be like forest fire, right? So many species of tree drop seeds that won't even germinate without extreme temperatures. They literally rely on like relatively rare forest fires for the propagation of their species. And without a fire sweeping through a forest, eventually all of those same trees would grow old and die out without being replaced. So evolution is, I guess, another area that seems to benefit from random rare events. Obviously, this doesn't apply to the individual members of a given species, since extreme events are most likely going to be painful and then fatal to the organism. But for those that survive and adapt to the event, they will be left better off and more robust than they were before, right? Like you can see this kind of in fast motion with the evolution of bacteria towards antibiotic resistance. Obviously the introduction of the antibiotic is a horrific event for 99% of the bacteria that are exposed to it, since they die. But for the 1% that survive, and therefore for the species as a whole, the event makes them much stronger, right? Because now a good portion of the bacteria who are born from that 1% will grow up resistant to the antibiotic and basically ready to take on a world where that particular antibiotic is no longer a threat to their species. Thus, the individuals mostly much worse off, but the species as a whole better off, right? So the species is something that would be described as anti-fragile by the premise of the book, while the individual organisms are certainly in the fragile category. If that makes sense. So now that we have covered the basic premise of the book, we can jump a little bit into what I liked about it. First of all, it's clear that Taleb is a genius. I said that before. I'll say it again. Whatever you think of the man, he has a certain way with words that is honestly just super enjoyable. Even like a lowly peon like me can understand concepts that would otherwise be way, way, way outside of my wheelhouse, way beyond my abilities to understand, just because of the detail and care that the author takes to explain things in universal terms. So let's dive into what I liked about the book. Okay, so things I loved about this book. Now, as I said before, I just love how Taleb is able to take just complex ideas and distill them down into useful and really digestible analogies. In my experience, it's a skill that many like extremely intelligent people lack, and it's one of the biggest obstacles to them getting their great ideas out into the wider world, right? Because academics tend to use like a lot of field specific jargon, I guess, in some ways to signal to other academics that they are smart and well read and they know the literature, they know what they're talking about, and that's useful, right? But the effect of always doing that is that your ideas, which might be awesome and just what humanity needs right now, just they're not going to go anywhere because of the way that you framed them. Lay people they're perfectly capable of understanding extremely complex ideas in any field, as long as you don't deliberately shroud those ideas in a proprietary jargon, right? I mean, I found this is the case particularly in law, where, the whole industry is basically an elaborate scheme to charge people to write simple concepts in an extremely complicated secret language, and then to charge them again on the back end to decipher that secret language. And if only lawyers can do it, then you need a lawyer to do it for you. Then this is becoming, I think, more and more obvious as time goes on, and as the internet kind of allows more people to peek behind the curtain on how the law works. And I think it's maybe one of the main reasons that people don't like lawyers very much. You get the sense that they're deceiving you, pulling the wool over your eyes. In fact, let's get another lawyer joke going up in here. How many lawyers does it take to change a light bulb? None. They'd rather keep their clients in the dark. Classic. So it's funny. I actually know several lawyers who really, really, really hate these jokes, but I think they're freaking hilarious. Don't take yourself so seriously. Life's short and we're all idiots anyway. So, all right, back to the book. As I said, I loved the delivery in this book. I also got a kick out of Taleb's periodic drive-bys of entire industries where he'd slam, lawyers, then doctors, then economists, and then academics, and anyone else who happened to fall in his crosshairs, right? In fact, the section on doctors was particularly interesting to me, since there's a decent amount of evidence, and there always has been, right, that doctors are, I guess we could say, they're biased towards doing things, even if those things aren't what ought to be done, over just leaving people alone and letting them work it out and heal or whatever. Obviously, this isn't true for, life-threatening incidents. Like if your appendix bursts or whatever, go see a doctor, right? In those cases, doctors can and do perform miracles, and we should all be extremely grateful to have them around for that reason. They're dedicated, intelligent, well-trained professionals. And I, for one, would not be here if it were not for a skilled doctor who could take out a stupid appendix, right? But if a patient in general shows up to their general practitioner presenting some small symptoms, there's an expectation from that patient and therefore a pressure on the doctor that he or she will do something immediately to help fix the patient's problem. And a lot of times, the best thing to do would just be like, oh yeah, go home, get some sleep, eat some soup, whatever, right? Exercise and eat well, right? That's supposed to be the cure for basically, so much in your life that's going wrong. Get lots of sleep, exercise, and eat, not garbage, right? If you look at the doctors, that's what they're doing, most of them. So, but anyways, a lot of times the interventions that these doctors prescribe, what they do is, fairly benign, right? But Taleb argues in the book that in bulk, these actions over the course of an entire system of doctors biased towards modest action, right? It drastically increases the overall risk of what's called iatrogenic, caused by doctors, complications, right? So if 1 in 50 patients who is prescribed a cholesterol reduction medication is saved from some kind of heart disease, and that's not altogether certain, since I think the jury is still technically out on cholesterol. We tend to be pretty sure we know what it does and how it reacts to different things, and then we also tend to later on find out we were wrong about that. So cholesterol is one of those things that seems to be an indicator, but isn't necessarily what we think it is, right? Correlation, causation, all that jazz, right? So as I was saying, if 1 in 50 patients, let's say, is prescribed a cholesterol medication, they're saved from heart disease. That benefit needs to be weighed against the other 49 patients who not only weren't helped by it, but were subjected to all of the potential side effects of the drug without receiving any benefit, right? So at the end of the day, you might see over a wider system of our medical system, a lot more side effects than help, because what ends up being kind of a mild condition is treated by a mild drug, but over vast swaths of patients, some people might have very unmild side effects to those drugs that they would not have otherwise gotten if the doctors had just kind of left them alone, right? So, don't judge doctors. At the end of the day, they're just poor, lost fools like the rest of us, just trying to navigate a world that none of us really understand, and they're just doing their best. And I give them a lot of credit for that. But on the other hand, we should always remember that it wasn't all that long ago that doctors recommended things like leeching, bloodletting, and lobotomies, right, to treat what were essentially everyday maladies, right? And they were wrong. They just were. And one need not use too much imagination to think about what procedures today might be looked back on as barbaric and ignorant. I hate to put doctors through the ringer here. It's everyone I know who's in medicine is a really good person. And so I don't mean to imply anything by this, but we should be conscientious of the impacts that our decisions have on patients over a broad system, right? And if we're not conscientious of that, then we'll make poorer decisions, right? So I loved that about the book. I also loved kind of the quotability of this book, right? Taleb has such a cool way of like turning a phrase. For example, let me read you this passage from the book, and I won't normally quote directly big chunks from the book, right? But this one talks about interventions that are designed to fix problems in complex systems, just kind of as a general rule, right? And so he says, because of opacity, an intervention leads to unforeseen consequences, followed by apologies about the unforeseen aspect of the consequences, then to another intervention to correct the secondary effects, leading to an explosive series of branching, unforeseen responses, each one worse than the preceding one. Yet simplicity has been difficult to implement in modern life because it is against the spirit of a certain brand of people who seek sophistication so that they can justify their profession. Oof. If that isn't law, I don't know, or public policy, right? I don't know what is. It's basically, he's arguing less is more. It's usually more effective. Systems that are anti-fragile, like the economy, like nature, they tend to benefit more from us leaving them alone than trying to fix them and causing another problem. And, we end up running out of fingers to plug the leaks in the dam, when really we probably should just get out of the way and let nature or the market or whatever the system is, right, resolve itself. And if things are anti-fragile, then a big wild event not only will not hurt the system, but it'll actually benefit the system in the long run, so long as we get out of the way, right? That's kind of his thesis. So I love that. I also love the way that Taleb describes like the weaknesses and limitations of applied statistics. And I did a lot of statistics in my undergrad. Thankfully, I don't do that much now. But so, for example, right, if a statistician were to examine the relationship between a butcher and a turkey, they would understandably come to the conclusion that the butcher is nothing but good for the turkey, right? The butcher feeds the turkey, shelters it, protects it from predators, makes sure that it is fat and content and healthy and peaceful and sleeps well and eats well. The butcher to the turkey, according to the statistician, is a saint, right? And on 999 out of 1,000 days, the statistician would definitely be correct about that relationship. But on the 1,000th day, the day that the butcher's real intentions are revealed to the turkey, those statisticians would be proven to have been wrong all along. And we should be mindful of this possibility, right? Like, we don't necessarily know, we know that we're reading data, but we don't necessarily know what the relationship is. We don't have a broad enough vision for that. We aren't high up enough in the cosmic food chain or whatever to be able to see how these things really are and how they interact. So on 999 days, which we're in most of the time, obviously, as a matter of statistics, the turkeys and butchers, they get along great. They have a great relationship, right? But we got to be wary of that 1,000th day. Okay. It kind of in that same vein, he warns about using averages to describe a situation. And just so you guys know, I'm changing these analogies a little bit, quite a lot, actually, to kind of give them my own spin. And I do that for several reasons. First, in my arrogance, I think that I can describe it in a way that is probably going to be more entertaining to you guys, at least in my opinion. Second, transposing these ideas into my own language and then speaking them is just kind of the way that I learn and absorb things best. So that's my preference, just for me. If nobody ever ends up listening to this podcast and I am the only person who ever goes back and listens to it, I want to have my own kind of distilled version of the things that I've learned, preserved versus, whatever obscure thing the actual author said. And third, I don't want to plagiarize the man's work directly, right? Because it would be good, I think, for you, if you are into this, to go and read the book yourself. Then you can get a more masterful, certainly, application of these concepts, right? That said, though, here is a modified concept about the dangers of using averages to describe situations, right? So, because they might not be describing what you think. And in fact, they can be used to hide a lot of ugliness, right? So for example, would you feel comfortable leaving your dog for 5 hours in a room where the average temperature is 70 degrees? Your instinct and mine is probably to say, yeah, of course, that would be totally fine. 70 degrees is a reasonable temperature to keep a dog at. What if then you learned that for the first hour, the temperature would be 350 degrees, and for the next 4 hours, it would be 0 degrees Fahrenheit? When you add the 5 hours up and then divide them, you add those temperatures up, divide them by 5 to get the average, then you get an average temperature of 70 degrees. But what you actually have is a very well cooked and then deep frozen puppy, right? At that average temperature of 70 degrees. So averages can hide a lot as well. And you should be careful with them, because if your system is fragile and you're trying to be careful with it, then averages don't tell a good story, right? If you're whatever it is that you're evaluating can be damaged by high or low numbers, then using the average to evaluate whether you should or should not do something is not always the best way, right? So, and another fascinating concept from the book is the idea of signal versus noise, right? That, like, the thing that you're looking for versus all of the distracting diversions around that thing, right? The needle in the haystack, so to speak. And the idea is in the book that the harder you're looking for something, the more haystack you end up finding, and the less likely you will be to find the needle, since the act of looking actively generates more haystack, and there is only so much needle, kind of as a law, right? So the example the author gives is somewhat like this. He says, when you're walking in the woods, you're looking for bears, you're actively looking for bears. If you see a stone that kind of looks like a bear, you might get startled, right? You might confuse it for a bear. However, the opposite is not true, right? You're not likely to see a bear and then be, oh, is that a rock? Right? Like, the difference is that sorting noise from signal, the thing that you're looking for, becomes more difficult the more samples that you take, right? Since bears are so much rarer than stones, if you go looking for bears, you will be startled often by stones. Rather than if you simply go walking with the knowledge that a bear might be present and trust that you will know it when you see it, and you will know it when you see it, right? You're not going to see a bear running at you from the woods and be like, oh, is that a rock over there? But you might see a suspicious shaped stone and think, oh man, it's a bear, right? So contrary to popular belief, more data doesn't necessarily bring more accuracy, right? It simply negatively affects the noise to signal ratio. And so we should be conscientious of that too. There's kind of a prevailing narrative that the more data you have, the better off you are. That's just not true necessarily, right? So we got to be mindful of that. And also throughout the book, Taleb just has like this neat folksy wisdom that I just enjoyed. I just thought it was like a little treat, right? So he said, when you start a job, you should write your resignation letter at the start, before you even start that job. Keep it in a drawer there at your desk and live free, knowing that you can leave at any time. Do this even and especially for your dream job, right? That way you know that every day you're there voluntarily and that you have your exit anytime you want. And that's the other thing that I just loved about Taleb personally. And I did some research about the author kind of in preparation for this podcast. he is a doer. He's not just a talker. He's not just in theory. In fact, he condemns people who just act in theory. And I think that's his big beef with Friedman, right? Is that Friedman, he's this great thinker, I think, but he was just wrong. He was just wrong about the financial collapse in 2008, and he still has a job, and people still defer to him as this great thinker on the economy. And I think that's fair. Anyone can be wrong, and it doesn't necessarily mean that their career should be over. But Taleb has a no tolerance policy for that. He's like, no, people who are wrong don't get to be in charge anymore. People who suck at this don't get to keep telling us how we should do things because they're wrong, and they were wrong last time. They'll be wrong again. And he's big on what people in the academic world call praxis, right? Which they should just call practice. Taleb practices what he preaches. He works in investment. He calculates probabilities, and he's made a decent living on that. And I actually really respect, as I said before, I respect people who are out in the world doing things. And so I have a lot of respect for Taleb as an author. And those are the things that I liked about the book. We'll wrap that section up and we'll head over to our respective corners. And it occurs to me, if you listen to episode 1, I did the news corner. That was a dumb idea. I'm changing that. I'm changing that right now. News doesn't keep for very long. And depending on when you get to this podcast, it could be very, very old news. And so I think I'm going to go ahead and just not do that. Instead, I'm changing the corners to the science corner, the history corner, and the trivia corner. So the random corner is still going to stay pretty much the same. And the learning corner is being transformed to the history corner, and the news corner is being transformed to the science corner. So now we have 2 learning corners, which suits me better, right? Honestly, the news is dumb. So anyways, without further ado, let's go over to the science corner. Oh yeah. I actually think that music works better for the science corner than it ever did for the news corner. I'm happy with this change. I hope you're happy with it too. Let's talk about science. So today we are in the field of mechanical engineering because, why not? And I wanted to talk about something that I learned about this week, torque converters. Now, a torque converter is it's a device inside of a car that is inside, I guess, if your car is an automatic transmission, that is, you don't have to shift it. It's not a manual. You don't have to push the clutch and shift it yourself manually. It's an automatic. That is a torque converter. Okay. So it's a more complicated device. In fact, the German gentleman who described it in the YouTube video described it as the most complicated device in modern cars. I don't know if that's true, but whatever, that sounds right to me. It's certainly very complicated. So the way a torque converter works is there's a fluid interchange, right? And I'm going to try my best to describe this in a way that fits this non-visual medium. But there's a fluid interchange between the engine and the transmission. And on the engine side, there is a turbine that spins with the crankshaft of the engine, right? So the engine, it's rotating around at X number of RPM, and then it spins inside of this fluid interchange, and the fluid ends up spinning really fast as well. And on the other side, not touching that turbine, is another turbine that's attached to the transmission and the wheels of your car, right? That's so when you hit the brakes, that turbine doesn't spin, and when you let go of the brakes, that turbine is able to spin more freely. And the way that the torque exchange works, the torque converter works, the best way that I've come up with, or the best analogy that I've seen out there for it, is if you think about 2 fans that are facing each other, like air fans, like blower fans. One of them's unplugged. The unplugged side is the transmission side. The plugged in side is the engine side. That's the powered side. And so you're plugged in at the engine, and you're getting power. And so that fan blade is spinning, and you face the fans face to face across a short space, right? So the air acts in this case as the fluid would act in the actual torque converter. And if you are holding on to the unplugged fan, then the blade won't spin. But if you let go of it, then the blade will start to spin as that air from the powered fan passes over it, and it'll spin slower, but kind of proportionate to the power of the engine, right? That's the best way I can think of to talk about a torque converter and how it works. And it uses fluid, and it uses fancy devices with specifically angled blades to kind of affect the way that the fluid flows. But, the simplest way to describe that device is that it has a powered section that is blowing this liquid, this transmission fluid, over an unpowered section. And if you hold on to the powered section, that is with the brakes, you don't allow the powered section to move forward, then it won't move. But if you release it and allow it to move forward and then apply power over it, then it will start to turn, and then your wheels start to turn. So that's how a torque converter works in an automatic car. I thought that was super fascinating. It's a very cool device. And that was the science corner. Now let's move over to the history corner. Oh my goodness. I think we might have a podcast on our hands, ladies and gentlemen, because that music is perfect for the history corner. It's like it was made for it. Okay, so let's talk history. Today, because we mentioned iatrogenic injuries, that is injuries caused by doctors to their patients inadvertently. I wanted to talk about a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis. Semmelweis is how it's spelled. Semmelweis is most likely, I assume, how it's pronounced. I don't know. I'm going to go with Semmelweis, though, because I like the way that sounds better, and I'm pretty sure that's how it is. Anyways, this guy, Dr. Semmelweis, was a doctor back in ye olden days of medicine, 18-something, doesn't matter super much. Look it up if you're super interested in it. This is kind of during a time in medicine where germ disease kind of finds its infancy, right? Where what we now know to be bacteria and viruses. That's kind of what they are discovering at this point. Up until then, they thought it was, bad humors, or, you didn't have the right amount of phlegm versus yellow bile in your system, or whatever their idea was, bad air. I don't know. Doesn't matter. It wasn't real. They were wrong about it. We now know it's bacteria and viruses that cause these diseases. At least we are. If you remember Dr. Thorne's quote from the last episode, where that's kind of our going theory. And I'm going to say we're pretty certain with it. We're not 100% sure, because you can't really be in the grand scheme of things. Like I said, take it with a grain of salt. But I think germ theory is a good theory. Everything I know about it sounds right. So I'm going to say it's right because I think it is. And I get to just say that. So at this time, though, doctors are just kind of figuring that out. They are performing autopsies kind of as a routine thing nowadays, and they're really rudimentary, right? Like if a guy's heart is exploded and his liver is made of jelly, they're like, oh yeah, that's probably what killed this guy. But they can't see sophisticated illnesses as well as we can now. That field has evolved, as all fields do, over time. But this is kind of like the time in medicine where it's going on. So that's kind of the background. And Semmelweis, he goes to work in the General Hospital in Vienna, where there are tons and tons of women in the maternity wards there. They're just dying from what's called puerperal fever. It's commonly known as childbed fever at the time. And Semmelweis tried to figure out what was killing these ladies. And there were two wards, one with midwives and one with doctors. And the ones with the doctors, the women who were in those wards were dying 5 times as often as the ones where the midwives were working. And so he's like, what's going on? And he had a bunch of theories that were interesting about like the priest's bell, or like I said, it's during the dumb era of medicine. So like he had a bunch of theories and he tried them, and eventually he came to realize that the main difference between the doctors and the midwives are that the doctors are performing autopsies. And he discovered this because one of the pathologists who performed an autopsy pricked his finger and died of childbed fever, and noticeably did so while not delivering a baby. And so he's like, it's not just women who are getting childbed fever. This man who did an autopsy on a woman who died of childbed fever definitely just died of childbed fever. And so the wheels started to turn there, and he realized, oh man, something's going on here. And so he decided, okay, well, we got to get all of the corpse juice off of the doctors and off of their instruments. So let's just wash them. And he kind of just I just kind of stumbled on like the most effective way of preventing the spread of disease, and that's washing things and killing germs. And he even came up with the use of chlorine, not because they knew that chlorine was a disinfectant. They didn't even know that bacteria existed, but because chlorine was super stinky. And he's like, this will help to disguise the smell of the corpses from the doctor's hands and from the doctor's instruments, which it's just so gross when you think about it, that like you're sitting there and some doctor comes up with some rusty, bloody, corpse covered, nasty instruments, an active corpse on his hands. And he's like, okay, open wide, and performs some kind of a procedure on you. It's no wonder that hospitals were like, just literally, you were more likely to die in a hospital than outside of it, honestly. Right. They found, in fact, that's one of his big findings, was that the prostitutes who were giving birth in back alleys in the streets of Vienna, they had less of a chance of dying during childbirth than these women who were going to this supposedly prestigious high value hospital. Right. So a big problem. Anyways, the instrument washing, the hand washing totally did it, totally reduced the number of women who were dying. But Semmelweis, like Taleb, was a great big jerk face. He was butthead and not very tactful, and he publicly berated the people who disagreed with him. He made some very influential, very powerful enemies. He lost his job. He went insane. He was committed to an insane asylum where he later on contracted and died from hospital fever, which is ironic and sad and tragic, but also, you know, maybe that gives some credence to our suspicion that maybe we don't know everything, and that maybe there's a chance that we're wrong. And maybe these people who are making waves might have something to say after all, something to think about for sure. Now let's head over to the trivia corner. Now today, at the trivia corner, which again, I have to say, I freaking love that music. I think that one fits really well. At the trivia corner, I will either give you a piece of random information, like actual trivia, or I'll talk about something trivial in that sense of the word trivia. Today, we're going with trivial, and I'm talking about stiff necks because I have one. I have the sorest neck right now, and I just, I've never had one before. I'm going to turn 30 here next week, and I guess now that I'm 30, I can just throw out my neck putting on a sweater. That's a thing now, which, hooray, getting old. Anyways, I was looking up stiff neck and how to take care of it. And I just thought, man, this is some information that I didn't have before. So maybe I'll just put it on my podcast for people who don't have it before. It's super Googleable, but whatever. We're just going to go with that for today. If you have a stiff neck, ice it, heat it, but ice is the real trick. Turns out I thought heat was the best because heat felt the best, but no, ice is actually the way to go. Take some ibuprofen or something like that. Nice over-the-counter anti-inflammatory. Get some rest. Roll your neck around. Don't jerk it around like I was trying to do to try and. I've been trying to like crack my neck for some reason. I feel like if I could just get a real good crack on it, that would really help. And so I spent all day yesterday trying to crack my neck, and basically it's more sore now, obviously, because I'm an idiot and I did that before reading what I should do, which is, nice light stretching, heat it, ice it, and take some basic anti-inflammatories, and then a couple of days and your neck won't be sore anymore. So now I'm living in a world where I have made my injury worse through my incompetence. Hopefully you get to avoid that world. You probably would have anyways because you're not a dum-dum like me, but here we go. Now let's get back to the book. All right, so now we're going to wrap up this podcast, and in the interest of time, and because I also, don't have that much to say about what I didn't like about the book, let's just get right into it. And it should come as no surprise to you that the main thing that rubbed me the wrong way about the book was the author himself. He is obviously a jerk. And I don't say that to insult Mr. Taleb, who is an avid listener of this podcast. Mr. Taleb, Dr. Taleb, please forgive me. I don't mean to insult you, but you are really, really rude. The way you talk to people and about people who are your peers is offensive and not cool. And that was the main thing that rubbed me the wrong way. I, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, during a long rambly section, I too am disposed to bouts of arrogance and bouts of fighting with authority, but I witness and notice in myself that those things are wrong, that I am the problem, that I shouldn't be doing that. Right. I know that I'm being a butthead to people. I know that I shouldn't. Some pushing back against authority is useful, right? Some questioning authority, I think, is the way that we make progress. And so I'm not ashamed or afraid to do that. But you don't just go out of your way to kick somebody in the butt while they're not looking. You don't write a book just to smear your rivals and to take the opportunity to call them names and mock their life's work. That's not cool. That's not how you win anyone over to your idea. That, I think, is the main reason that Taleb is probably always going to be kind of a back burner figure in the world, is because he just doesn't know how to play nice with others. And if you want to persuade people, the best way to do that, top tip for anyone listening, is not to call them a moron and act like you're smarter than and better than them in every way. People hate that. And so for that reason, I have to say that this book, while I thought was super useful, I thought it was super worth my time. I really, really got a kick out of it. It's so tragic that the author's tone makes it so inevitably useless, right? Because the people who might be persuaded to his point of view to be more cautious about their use of statistics, they aren't listening because he's mean to them. And you can't blame them for not listening, because who wants to, who when confronted by a bully and a jerk is like, oh yeah, you know what, you're right. That gives me cause for deep self-reflection. So for that reason, I didn't like the book as much as I would have if the author had been more competent in that aspect. So let's go ahead and jump right to my patented, amazing, one-of-a-kind Bell's Thingy rating system. And here we go. That's right, everyone. I gave this book 3 stars. Why, you ask? Well, because the world is full of excellent books, and if I give them all 5 stars, then my rating system doesn't mean anything. It's useless. It's useless to you. It's useless to me. This book wasn't horrible, and it wasn't amazing. So right in the middle is where it belongs. And this is because, as I said, it's fun. It's engaging. It's a really, really great way to consume complicated ideas about statistics and economics and medicine and blah, 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 blah. It covers a vast array of super interesting topics, but the author is kind of a butthead, and so it's never going to be read. It's never going to be taken seriously, and I think that's such a tragedy, because this could have been a masterpiece, and I just don't think it's there. So 3 stars. That's what I'm giving it. I'm sticking to it, and it's time now for our parting thought. And today's parting thought comes from a Latin phrase that I heard and thought was super cool, because Latin is super cool. This phrase is durus dura franguntur, which translates loosely, of course, because Latin always translates loosely, to hard things are broken by hard things, or hard things are best, or hard things are most easily broken by other hard things. And this kind of refers to like ancient metalworking and even modern metalworking, right? Like if you have a cast iron pan, that's heavy, it's strong, but it's brittle and it'll shatter, right? It's particularly if you slam it against something hard. Hard things, that whole analogy, right? If you don't bend, you'll break. I think that's important for us to take into consideration for ourselves. If you're not willing to be flexible, stay humble, and kind of roll with the punches, be a willow in the breeze, or whatever metaphor you want to have on that, then when the hard things come, they'll break you. If you are hard and rigid and fixed in your ways and not willing to bend, if you're dura, right? Like if you're strong but brittle and unyielding, then when another strong, unyielding force slams into you, either you or it are going to shatter. And I wouldn't bet on, having lived life the way in the world that we live in. I've had hard things slam into me before, and I bet on the hard things breaking me before I break the hard things, for sure. So stay flexible, stay humble. When those hard things come along, you'll be better able to deal with them. That's the end of the show for this week. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please share it. I'm really hopeful that this can be useful to somebody out there in the world. If you are interested in picking up Antifragile, I recommend it. I didn't give it my best rating, but I do still recommend it, especially if you're into statistics and things like that. Still definitely worth your time. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. Any feedback would be welcome. Have a good day. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.